What does the Bud Light marketing campaign get wrong about men? Is the new Super Mario movie anti-woke? What are the ethics around swapping seats with other people on a plane? We'll talk about all of this and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather takes from all across the internet. We pick out good ones and bad ones, try to point out what's good about the good ones, and make arguments against the bad ones. My name is Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, all of that stuff. It helps us out. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take Bad Take Pod and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. Without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. The first one comes from David Hogg, and he tweets out, quote, "The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun," unquote. And he makes the argument, well, if that's the case, why don't we just replace all our fire extinguishers with flamethrowers? What are your thoughts, Donnie? Is this an apt analogy?
No, it's not. Obviously, that's a very stupid analogy. The funny thing about analogies is you have to have accurate measuring points for them to make sense. You have to have things that are translatable in both senses, and this is not. When you're talking about, the idea of the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, what you are talking about is you're saying that there is essentially someone with malintent, someone who is seeking to destroy things using the tool of a gun. And it's not literally the only way, but per the phrase, and the only way to stop that is to use the tools that they themselves are using as well to curb that force. So it's like, in the fire and the flamethrower and fire extinguisher analogy, the problem is fire is an unbridled destruction force that is not tempered. It's not directed. It just seeks to destroy. It might be, you could, if you wanted to make some weird analogy, you could say something about the only way to stop an oil fire is to use more oil to lead it away from the building, some really weird thing like that. But it's a terrible analogy because fire and a person with a gun are not the same at all. The gun is the tool by which the destruction happens. And I just don't think it's an apt descriptor at all, because the intent matters and the context, of course, of the situation themselves matter. It's just a poor analogy that doesn't actually get across the point he wants it to.
Yeah, the first thing I immediately thought when I saw this, I grew up a little bit far out there next to a farm, and my grandparents and other folks lived on farms, and I remember we would drive out to those places, or I one time saw a controlled burn close to my house. You actually do sometimes fight fire with fire, because if you've got a field that's caught on fire, or you need to, you want to do controlled burns to, eliminate dead growth so that there is less of a hazard for fire, you do end up actually using not necessarily flamethrower, but you use some sort of gas flame powered thing to light it on fire. And that's like you're saying, it speaks to the point of, there are tools to prevent fires. Sometimes fire is a part of them. It's not the best tool, right? Sometimes it's a tool of last resort. But you could even say that about guns, right? A gun is a tool of last resort to stop a bad guy from shooting up a school, right? There might be some other things you could do, which is some mental health stuff. You could address the cultural things. Liberals and leftists like David Hogg would say, we just got to take the guns away. But that's the equivalent of saying we're going to take all the tools. We're going to take the most effective tool that we can use as a fail-safe at the very end off the table from being able to be used by the right person. And in my opinion, that's just a really dumb, scenario. In a life or death scenario, you want to have all the tools available at your discretion to be able to use. So it's a bad analogy right from the get-go. It also is not real, right? Because like I was saying, you use fire with fire, and it's just not representative of the real world, right? The only way, oh, well, David, tell me about another time where a bad guy with a gun was stopped by a non-violent mean, right?
Yeah.
And if you have to concede that you have to use violence to stop someone with a gun, well, then maybe you should be talking about what is the most effective use of violence, or the effective tool to use violence and enact it quickly from distance without risk of personal harm to you. It's definitely a gun, right? You can use your fist, or you can use a knife or whatever, but no one wants to be using, to take the proverbial bring a knife to a gunfight sort of deal. So yeah, it's just a bad analogy all around.
Yeah, I think that these people have the most, I think it's probably in many cases not an ignorance, but a willful neglect of the idea that there are people in society who are going to be dangerous no matter how many laws you have, no matter what kinds of systems, no matter how authoritarian you make the system you live under. And I think the problem with that reality is that if they have to acknowledge that, then it continues the argument down the line how much authoritarianism is too much if these people, if these dissidents, whatever you want to call them, these sort of uncontrolled chaotic actors are always going to exist. And that ranges from someone who's an unhinged evil lunatic who wants to shoot up a school to all the way to someone who just wants to think for themselves and start a revolution in your authoritarian regime, right? There
Yeah,
are always going
that's
to
a
be
great
people
point.
you can't control. And so if they're saying, oh nope, this is the only, that the idea that this will always exist cannot be acknowledged, because then it puts the onus on them to show what measures are reasonable. And I think that that's also why they'll ignore things like the fact that most shootings happen with handgun pistols, because right now it's easy to vilify the big scary looking assault rifle, which isn't really a thing. uh, and because there's an easier way. That's sort of the artificial barometer of what is acceptable. And if we just get rid of these scary looking ones, then we will stop all bad things, and then they'll just keep moving the goalpost. But if they acknowledge that no matter what, this chaos exists, then rather than keep moving the goalpost forward, they will have to defend all of the turf that they've taken backwards.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, so I think that's the problem with like these analogies, is they just act as though, oh well, fires and just replace it with flamethrowers. And it's not to say, well, okay, well, maybe the idea is like with forest fires, like you were, and I mean that's also a great example, is to say like you shouldn't eliminate all forest or all wood chopping in the sense, because that makes forest fires worse. So what you should do is you should manage forests so that when forest fires occur, you don't have to bring in the last minute resort. You have ways to defend that and stuff like that. Yeah, a much better analogy is like, we don't want to chop down trees ever. If you're saying that the only way to stop forest fires is by getting rid of more trees, it actually is, because when you cull timber harvests, you create less dead trees, less dense forests, and they spread less far. So his little stupid analogy, if you mold it the right way, you can kind of get it to make sense a little bit, but it's really bad.
yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Representative Ted Lieu. I believe he's from, I don't know where he's from actually.
I want to say Texas, but I don't know if that's true.
Yeah. Anyways, he tweets out, below is a pregnancy at 9 weeks.
California,
Religious
sorry.
zealot judge said myth tone. I should have looked up how to pronounce this, but an abortion drug caused, quote, psychological trauma to woman who saw abortion remains. Under this religious reasoning, judge could ban Viagra for psychological trauma to any men for using Viagra to have sex outside of marriage. And then he posts a picture of a gestational sac that looks like, it literally looks like a clump of cells, because the gestational sac kind of is a clump of cells. It's not the actual baby, it's just the thing that holds the baby. But he titles it and captions it 9 weeks of pregnancy. What are your thoughts?
This is just kind of a weird scenario all around. But the idea that I think the thing that sticks out to me the most is he says, this religious zealot judge. Of course, anyone you dislike, you're gonna start with the red, or the name calling, and start with the attacks by saying, oh, this extremist who has views. And then it says, oh, this causes psychological trauma to women who see abortion remains. Under this religious reasoning, it's like women have trauma from seeing, the carcass of a dead baby. Wow, you can't use that as a psychological trauma. That's such religious zealot reasoning. That's an absurd thing to think. I mean, in the sense that compassion is religious, then yeah, but that to me is what strikes me the most, is that he tries to dismiss this entire line of reasoning to say that women have emotional distress, women have emotional trauma from seeing the dead remains of a baby, and then say, oh, that's just religious reasoning. Regardless of the legality, it's just kind of a funny, weird framing of the debate.
Yeah, and he does something kind of tricky here, where he's like, oh, they get psychological trauma because they saw the remains, and oh, here's a picture that is not representative of the
Yeah,
remains. but looks like it's like a non big deal, right? Like, oh, this is what they're seeing. It's like, well, no, that's not what you actually see. Like, my wife's pregnant right now. We had an ultrasound done at 8 weeks, and that is not what our kid looked like, right? Like, that is what what the baby is actually in looks like, but that is not actually what a baby looks like. A baby at that age, you can actually make out certain features like where its eyes are. It's already starting to have a little bit of a skull. It already has its gender determined. You can make out the outline of a nose and basically the outline of the whole baby, right? If you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, that's a baby. So it's really dishonest that he uses this picture. And it's funny because he retweeted. I was like, a lot of people have been commenting that this was a fake picture or something like that, but here are the facts, and he just links to the article that this picture is from, and it's like, yeah, dude, you literally like screenshot it and covered over the caption, which said gestational sac at 9 weeks, to add your own caption on it. So yeah, the facts are that you're lying, about
Yeah.
this. And what's crazy, I can't remember the statistics on it, but my wife and I have supported an organization here that actually uses van ultrasound machines to show women their baby before they go in to have an abortion. It's just like, hey, like, if you want to see it, we'll offer this service to you for free. And there's a lot of them that choose after seeing their baby on the ultrasound to not go have an abortion because they realize that the baby that's in their stomach is not actually in their uterus is not actually this clump of cells that this guy's put out there. It's an actual human being, right? But there's been so much of this unscientific disinformation, to use their words against them, that people have put out that it's before 10 weeks it's just a clump of cells. That's not true at all.
Yeah, that's also the point at which they will vehemently argue how you should not have access to more information. Like they'll use sort of along the same lines of him saying things are religious reasoning or zealot reasoning or whatever he wants to say. They'll say, oh, it's emotional manipulation to show what the baby looks like beforehand, and that is, I mean, that's a kind of shocking admission. Now, to be clear, no one's saying that directly here, but that is the tacit admission of the further conversation being had here about, oh, well, here's the actual article showing this deceptive picture, and based on actual conversations I have had with people who argue against like ultrasounds as a thing. It's like, in so many other respects of big government, big power type, left, generally left of center, although sometimes right of center people too, all they care about is allowing people to see what they want them to see and no more. They do not want them to have the full picture. The idea of unbridled access to information is scary. The idea of transparency is scary. And so they can say, oh, it's just emotional manipulation to see the baby, before you're going to have an abortion. It's like, no, it's not. That gives you a clearer understanding of what you're doing. Like, would you say that it's better to, well, and maybe if your name is Obama or any of the presidents of the last, 2 decades, the answer is yes. But I was gonna say, is it better to close your eyes and not know when you blow up someone's home, or if someone breaks into your home? Is it like, if you're taking someone's life, like, that should be something where you're seeing it. You should know the full weight of your of the actions. Like, I don't believe that you should take a life lightly.
Exactly, and they put all this emphasis on, well, it's the woman's choice and it's the most important choice she'll ever make. It's like, yeah, and if it is the most important choice she should ever make, shouldn't she have all of the available information made
Exactly.
available to her? Yeah.
Yes, exactly right.
Cool. I don't have any more on this.
All
If you
right,
don't,
cool. Let's move. Yeah, let's
right.
go.
Move away from Ted Lieu. Next one. We've got Saratoga Smitty, and this is a tweet. It's a reply to a video of the Anheuser-Busch marketing director basically saying, hey, the reason we partnered with Dylan Mulvaney was because we need to take the image of Bud Light away from, frat boy to, make it more young and cool and all this stuff. And Saratoga Smitty tweets out, when you advertise to men, you want the ad to put them in the situation you present in order to evoke an emotional response of relaxation and happiness in order to correlate your product to that emotional feeling. Most men live lives of stress, constantly fixing problems and responsibility for others. Imagery that shows a temporary escape from that normal life is what speaks to the souls of men. Not to make any political commentary, but when you use imagery that makes a lot of men uncomfortable, then this becomes that feeling that they now convey to your product. Instead of a cold beer being the reward at the end of a tough week, that meaning has now been taken away and replaced by something else. What do you think about this marketing advice, Donnie?
I think it's fantastic, right? Because so much of marketing is emotional, right? So much of marketing does have to do with uh, giving the demographic you are targeting a certain feeling, or conveying a certain emotion, and the this analysis highlights not only a very sound principle of how you get there and what kinds of logic make sense there, but you also see just how lame and transparent the Bud campaign is to say, oh, we're just trying to make it hip and cooler, which is like, well, okay, that's one line of thought, but who is your actual core demographic? Who are you actually
Yeah.
going to try to make this out? And I think what it exposes them as, rather than just going for the younger crowd that they need, they want to appeal to the social clout. They want to be, they want to appeal to the right crowds. They want to fit in, even if it costs them among their core demographic. Because no no good marketing individual, no good business says, hey, our core demographic, let's piss them off because we need to shift core demographics right now. That's not a good marketing strategy, and that's essentially what the original person is saying they're doing. And this line of reasoning highlights and kind of exposes them for actually just wanting to appeal to the social conventions of what is and isn't appropriate and cool.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, about alienating your core demographic, and I think a lot of these people lack purpose in their lives when they come into these jobs, and they try to infer some sort of purpose and have some sort of battle, or a cultural statement they try to make, into their job and into their objectives, rather than the objective being like, oh, I just want to do a good job and like continue to grow the core demographic of this brand. And I think about Bill Burr has this hilarious bit on how like men are the primary consumers of sports, like live sports, and we like to watch the best people play sports, and that happens to be men. So we get together, we turn it on, we'll watch through all the ads, we'll eat food, and that makes us happy. And then feminists come along and say, "Oh no, like we need to have more women in sports. Men, you need to watch more women's sports." But then the women end up not watching the sports anyways, right? They have interest in other stuff. Um, and so with that, like it's like, oh, you're gonna like preach to this core demographic that loves your product, telling them they should like something else that they don't like. Like that's just not a good strategy, and it's not going to win anything.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was analysis given a while ago about how when a corporation, well, any business, but usually corporations, reach a certain size and saturation in the market, and they've established themselves beyond the threat, beyond a realistic threat of someone coming up and taking them over, or at least seriously challenging them for a long time, they start trading in dollars for social currency and social credit. And that, I think, is what we're seeing in this case, as well as in the I like the thing with like the M&Ms with the International
Yeah.
Women's Day promoting a trans person there, things like that. It's these major corporations that can't afford to, like, they can't, or the businesses that can't afford to fail don't engage in this because they realize how alienating it can be. But the ones that are powerful and up the chain, they want to appeal to the right powerful government people, essentially. The ones who have the power, the ones who are in the controls, and they know that they can distract the population with things of diversity and gender identity and stuff like that. So once they show, hey, we're willing to play nice with this side, maybe they're losing some dollars, but they're gaining that social credit uh amongst the elite, and I think that that's probably what's going on here.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a whole series of tweets from Spencer A. Clavin. And he writes out, the idea that conservatives would celebrate Dungeons and Dragons or Mario as or even anti woke is, in fact, a total victory for wokeness. It shows how thoroughly they've managed to set the terms of the debate. I quite like D&D, but it features an axe-wielding girl boss who ground pounds bruisers twice her size, while hapless dweeb Chris Pine looks on in sayful appreciation. Mario rewrites the damsel in distress as a warrior princess at the helm of vast armies. 10 years ago, conservatives would have pointed to both of these movies as standout examples of obnoxiously preachy, in your face feminism. Now they're celebrating because Luigi isn't trans. We're begging for scraps at this point. I will once again add D&D was well done. Mario looks fine. It's not about either movie in itself, it's about the idea that either represents a return to some pre woke normal. It feels that way. If it feels that way, that only represents how thoroughly such a normal has been taken from you. What do you think?
I think this is a really good take because on the one hand, I think there's a difference between saying I was really glad not to see this amount of wokeness in a movie or something like that, right? And I think this kind of actually harkens back to the everything everywhere all at once discussion we had, because on the one hand, I was really glad that the end message was like decent and good in that, right? It was something where I could appreciate it, even if even if I didn't know how it got there. But I still don't think that was a total victory because like it still promoted like a antisocial conservative agenda in the sense that you had to accept sort of the progressive definition of family, and that was kind of some of the pushback I had with Andy Craig's take, if you remember. And so I think this is kind of the further thought down that road, which is, even when you have maybe say a politically neutral movie, the fact that conservatives are now celebrating and cheering that and saying, yeah, finally, like in your face. And I would say like maybe this was also an example like with Top Gun. It's like that just highlights how far the culture has moved and how far the progressives have won. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say I really appreciated that it didn't have that. But I think that's their game of inches and miles, is that then people kind of stop there and they don't say, but we need to create art that actually promotes good things and celebrates the beautiful and celebrates truth. And so when you sort of satisfy people and you just push it to sort of that neutral boundary and say, oh, it was so refreshing not to have wokeness shoved in your face, like that's the goalpost moving and the Overton window closing.
Yeah, I when my wife and I saw Mario this past weekend, and we walked out. I was like, oh yeah, we enjoyed it, right? Like it's made
Yeah.
for kids. Full disclosure, like if you go to it expecting some awesome plot and moral premise to be laid out and thoroughly thoroughly explained, then no, you're not going to get that. It's just a good old fashioned hero movie. And there is a little bit of like damsel in distress stuff. I don't actually particularly mind it. I feel like Peach kind of earns it, to be honest with you, in the movie. But regardless of that, like I told my wife, I was like, yeah, I can't tell like if we think this is so good because everything else has been so bad for so
Yeah.
long. And and on top of that, like basically all of the IP that we loved growing up that actually had good stories, good morals, good everything in it, good storytelling, they've just totally adopted and wrecked, right? So it's kind of like refreshing to see them not totally destroy something that is as near and dear to our hearts as Mario. And I don't know if you saw this at Star Wars Celebration, but they're going to be continuing the sequel trilogy. I thought literally no one asked you to do this.
Yeah.
Like in fact, we've actually asked you to not do that. So I think that Spencer is completely right. I mean, this is if you're not growing, you're dying, right? If you're not advancing the culture war, you're losing it. And this is not an advancement in our favor of the culture war. It's just kind of like a little bit of a reminiscence of what used to be kind of normal. But it doesn't mean we're winning. It means we're actually going backwards. The fact that we consider this a win.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is, as he point as he points out with you know, the axe wielding girl boss, and Chris Pine looks on in soyful appreciation, and that
Oh,
and then
soyful. Yeah.
Mario, and yeah, the Mario story being rewritten with the damsel in distress as the warrior princess. The thing that is frustrating about it is that even in the case of like I don't know how D&D's history is, so I can't speak as much to that. But when you have an interpretation that feels like they knew they couldn't do the damsel in distress thing with Peach. They couldn't, because
Yeah.
people would have complained about it. That people would have thrown a fit, and that's the problem. It's not even that I have a problem with the idea of Peach being competent or not being the damsel in distress or whatever. It's just like it's frustrating because one, they're rewriting her character. From what I understand, the character that is played in the movie is much more akin to other characters in the Mario universe insofar as they have any development, like Princess Daisy, who's a little bit more outspoken and sort of uh tomboyish, I suppose. But
Yeah.
they just totally changed. It's not the same character. And it doesn't feel like they did that out of again, I haven't seen it yet, so I could be wrong here, but at least from an outside perspective, it doesn't feel like that change was made because they thought we need a dynamic refresh on this character. It was probably made because they thought, oh, we're sending this to mass audiences. We need to make a girl boss character, otherwise we'll be. And so that to me is another example of Spencer's big point, which is that the entire premise on which a movie is considered neutral is shifting. Because I think that a movie where the female character is a capable, competent, doesn't get kidnapped character is fine. That's great. That should be within the realm of neutral or good movie. That's perfectly fine. But the same luxury is not afforded if the female character is captured and needs to be rescued by a man. That can never be good, and it could never be neutral in today's sort of cultural paradigm of movie plots, and that's frustrating.
Yeah, I was actually, I mean, I know you're gonna see it, but like the primary motivation of Bowser, like I was expecting like, oh, they're gonna totally change it. Because in the games and stuff, Bowser's primary is somewhat romantic, or like, oh, I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
have. And I
totally.
was like, they're gonna change that because that is a little too damsel in distressy. But they actually didn't. Like
Oh, that's good.
yeah, that's his primary motivation.
Yeah.
Even though she is still a little bit of a girl boss in it. But I mean, there's certain elements of it that's like I feel like it's kind of earned. But I agree with you, and that decision that they made was not because it's like, oh well, this is more what Peach's character is. It was more of like, well, we can't have a dainty feminine princess being saved from the dragon by the unlikely hero. That would just be too much. They almost get there, but not enough. And that was their primary motivation with how they did it, and that means we're losing.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing is, I think if you look in examples, even within Nintendo, now Nintendo's not known for creating the best stories in the Mario games. Most Mario games are pretty simple. It's like she gets kidnapped, you jump over blocks and rescue her. But there have been some games where they have more compelling stories, and I think that one of the examples of that is in I can't remember if it's one of the first two Paper Mario games. Those ones are a little
Yeah,
bit more narrative and story driven, and they have depth and character, and they're really interesting and fun and good. Highly recommend. I think it might be the second one. There's an entire plot point where, between missions, you're cutting away to Peach getting kidnapped. And there's character development as she like tries to escape out of the
that's
castle.
Thousand
She
Year
doesn't.
Door. Yeah,
Yeah, okay, that is Thousand Year Door. That's what I thought. Yeah. And then like she, writes letters to Mario. So there's like, but the thing about that was it didn't show as Peach is helpless. She was kidnapped, she had to be rescued, but she wasn't helpless. It showed that she had depth of character, and there was the actual stuff going on that made it interesting. And it's like there's this paradigm where people feel like, oh, if you have someone needing to be rescued, they automatically have become helpless or something like that, or they become less than. And that's just not true. And I think to assume that means that you have a limited scope of what you think good storytelling can be, or what good character development can be, or how you can convey strong characters in different ways,
yeah,
right? Not every strong character and not every female strong character needs to be up in front punching the bad guys just as hard necessarily. I'm not necessarily saying that there can't be cases where that's the character. I would argue that like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was a great example of a strong female character, not really girl bossing in an annoying way. But again, the fact is that you cannot have a neutral consideration of any other archetype for women in many cases. There has to at least be one girl boss character, and then you can have other types of women. But if you only depicted other types of women, then you're just not showing strong female characters, no matter what the development of their actual character is.
yeah, yep. All right, moving on to our last one. We got Matt Walsh retweeting a New York Post article. The New York Post article is titled "Passenger Refuses to Swap Seats So a Mom Could Sit with Toddler." And Matt Walsh retweets saying, "She asked him to switch out of his window seat and into a middle seat for a flight across the Pacific. Sorry, but that's way too great of a favor to ask of a stranger, especially when it's your own poor planning that caused the situation." What do you think?
So I think Matt's general premise is probably correct. I think his specific wording is wrong, but I would probably think that he doesn't mean it literally, that it's too great a favor to ask ever. Like I don't think he would, and maybe he would. He dies on weird hills sometimes. But my interpretation is, if you had poor planning, you come to this situation where you are separated from your child or something like that, and you ask for a swap. That's fine to ask, but I think that to refuse it is more than acceptable, and should be considered sort of the normal or the expected, especially because so many flight well, and maybe, maybe not now. I haven't booked flights that recently, but most flights you can pick your seats out ahead of time, and it isn't even a matter of paying to reserve the specific ones. You just kind of have to book early enough, and you can choose within, like the section, if you want to have two seats together or not. Now, sometimes things happen. Sometimes airlines change their rules and stuff, and honestly, there have been times when I've made requests for seat swapping arrangements because the airline didn't make something clear or goofed something up. Maybe it was technically my fault, but it was, hidden in the fine text that they could move seats at a certain point. And I've I've also been asked to move seats, and I've accommodated. I think there's a reasonable time and place to ask, but I also think that when you ask that, there should never be an expectation for it. And that the person who planned ahead, the person, you don't know what they did or did not choose. For all you know, they could have a debilitating flight sickness where they need to have a window seat, for instance, and they absolutely have to sit by that window seat, or else they get sick, or maybe they get absolutely terrified. There are people like that, and so I think that there are a lot of the times people are like, how dare you, how could you not, because they only hear the very visible side of the equation, which is, oh, it's a mom and their child who were separated. But you never get to hear the individual side, who was like, they had a really long work trip, they've been exhausted, they just needed a place to relax, so I would say that, yeah, you can ask, that's fine, but I think Matt is correct in that it's too great a favor to expect of a stranger. That's maybe how I would amend his take.
Yeah, and I think I think the thing that you're saying about how there's expectation probably conveyed with this request is the fact that it ended up in an article in the New York Post, right?
Yes.
So this person got refused and then decided, oh, I haven't read the article, but I'm going to put this person on public blast, to get them, whether they saw it on social media or wherever it was, to get my way. And I think, if you've got a mom with the toddler, they probably are going to ask pretty sympathetically. I mean, and I would switch with them, but I'm in a position where I can, right? I don't have any medical requirements. I'm also okay with that. I mean, a flight across the Pacific is a little bit more of a big deal, because a window seat is probably going to be some to the tune of $400 to $600 more in that instance. But the other aspect of it too, it's like, I mean, I don't know where they were sitting, but like, if the toddler was, if one of them was in the middle, if they needed to sit next to the toddler, that means one of them was sitting in an aisle seat or a window seat, right? So I don't know why they couldn't just switch with someone and say, hey, can you have the same aisle seat or something like that and switch with me? But yeah, I mean, this is kind of, I hate the plain public shaming that happens, when someone either gets dragged off or someone isn't doing something that someone doesn't want. It just kind of makes for a nasty culture, unfortunately. So I think Matt Walsh is right. He's kind of contributing to the nastiness in a way, but I think in premise he's right.
Yeah, I think it's frustrating too, because like this expectation almost gets dragged out into other areas as well, once you accept the premise of like, well, in this case, like the onus is on the guy to give up a seat because it's a mother and child. Then it feels like once you've taken away the sort of the idea of private property rights in that sense, you then you can say, well, if it's not the mother and child, or whatever other scenario you want to paint, it's like it becomes less and less important that it's because you purchased the ticket and because you have a right to that, because it was your money and your planning and your decision and your contract. All of that becomes diminished and diminished and diminished until it's like, well, if the situation is dire enough, then it's okay for your private property rights to not be respected. And I hate that idea a lot, because it's hard to defend the idea of private property rights in a sense. that it's not a person, it's not a personal thing. And so it's really hard in that sense. But it's so important to reiterate that even if the guy didn't pay for that seat, especially, even if that guy didn't have a tiring day, maybe he was just relaxed and happy, he still has a right to that seat first and foremost. It might be a good thing, it might be a nice thing to give it up, but there should never be an expectation of someone else's to give up their right necessarily in that way.
And it also kind of speaks to our culture too, right? Like, if you want to expect men to do things like that, to do honorable things like that, like there is a cost to that too, right? Like there is a cost of position, a cost of understanding that, like, okay, if men are expected to sacrifice in a way that no one else is expected to sacrifice, that means they're also entitled to certain rewards that other people are not entitled to, unless they also to make that sacrifice. And so that's one of the things that really bothers me about like these public things is like men get both the like, oh well, we expect you to act chivalrous, but also we're not, I shouldn't say equal, but we should be entitled to the same benefits as you without any of the downfalls, right? And that was I can't remember who I was listening to talk about this, but back during women's suffrage, like the suffragettes, the women that were against the suffragettes, which there were a lot of them, majority of them were like, hey, shut up. We don't want to be part of the draft, right? Because if we're saying equal, that means we're going to have to be part of the draft, and we kind of quite like not having to go to war. And then the suffragettes said, well, what if we can get equality in this way? I'll get all the rights that we want and voting rights that we want, but you also don't have to be drafted. Would you be on board? And then they got on board, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot of the culture that we've kind of had is that there are certain expectations put on people without also the honor, reward, and respect that goes along with it. And if we had a culture of honor and respect in this way, a culture that is balanced, that conforms to more traditional values, then men would be going out of their way, right, to offer this woman their seat. But because there is no reward, because there is no incentive, there is no culture of that. That's why we don't have people offering that, and we get situations like this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like the expectation has to go both ways in that sense, right? If you're expecting sacrifice, then you have to expect to sacrifice. So I think that's an astute point.
Cool. I don't have any more unless you do.
No, I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us. We appreciate your time. Please make sure again to like, share, subscribe, and message us with any takes that you find while you're scouring the internet. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Take care.